Federal sonar and cadaver dogs are currently scanning a secret location in the Sea of Abaco. Why? Because satellite data proves Brian Hooker sent search crews to the wrong place. Brian Hooker thought he committed the perfect crime. He thought that by staging a tragic accident in the middle of the isolated ocean, his dark secrets would stay buried forever at the bottom of the sea. For months, he successfully played the grieving husband, telling local Bahamian police a bizarre 9-hour survival story that completely fooled them into releasing him without a single charge. But Brian made one fatal mistake. He forgot about the digital ghost tracking his every move. Federal investigators bypassed his spoken words and went straight for his cell phone. What the satellite data revealed didn't just contradict his timeline, it shattered it completely. The trap is closing, the boat has been seized, and the FBI is hunting for what's left of Lynette Hooker. Subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now to stay updated on this active federal investigation as we break down every twist in the search for justice. Now let's take a step back and really look at what is happening here, because behind all the cold data points, coordinate numbers, and police reports, there is a real human being at the center of this tragedy. Lynette Hooker wasn't just a name on a missing person poster or a headline for people to click on. She was a deeply loved woman, a person with an entire life, a family, and close friends who are absolutely shattered right now. When someone vanishes into the vast, dark ocean like this, it leaves a massive, painful void in the lives of everyone who knew them. Her family has been living through a literal nightmare for 2 long months, waiting by the phone, praying for any shred of good news, and dealing with a level of agonizing grief that most of us cannot even begin to comprehend. It is just heartbreaking to think about. We really need to keep our focus entirely on Lynette and what her loved ones are going through right now, because they deserve the absolute truth about what happened that night out on the water, and they deserve to bring her home. Think about how completely devastating it must have been for her family when they first heard that the Bahamian police had arrested Brian, questioned him for 5 days, and then just let him walk right out the door without a single criminal charge. For 2 straight months, the public and her family had to sit back and watch this case go completely cold. Everyone genuinely thought this was just a tragic boating accident, one of those horrible, unexplainable situations where the ocean wins and a family is left to mourn a freak disaster. But while Brian walked free, got on a commercial plane, and flew right back to his comfortable life in the United States, something major was happening behind the scenes. The United States government quietly stepped into the picture. They didn't just sit back and accept the local island narrative. They bypassed the local authorities completely and upgraded this entire case from a simple missing person search to a suspected federal homicide. I see how people initially fell for the accident story, but when the feds step in like this and take over an international case, it means they are looking at something incredibly dark. For weeks and weeks, the entire world actually believed Brian's version of events. And honestly, if you listen to his initial story, it sounds like a literal horror movie that would terrify anyone. He claimed that he and Lynette were out in their small 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy in the middle of the night when the weather suddenly took a turn for the worse. The waves were crashing over the sides, the wind was howling, and it was pitch black all around them. He told the investigators that a sudden, massive wave slammed into the boat and knocked Lynette right over the side into the dark, churning water. But the specific twist in his story, the part that supposedly trapped him out there, was his claim that Lynette took the boat's ignition keys down into the water with her when she fell, right? He told the police that with the keys gone, the dinghy's engine cut out instantly, leaving him completely stranded in the middle of a rough sea with absolutely no way to start the motor, turn the boat around, or look for his drowning wife. He painted this incredibly dramatic and vivid picture of a desperate, helpless husband caught in an impossible nightmare. He said he had no choice but to sit in that tiny drifting boat, surrounded by miles of open ocean, and paddle with his bare hands or a tiny plastic oar for 9 agonizing hours straight in the dark. He claimed he fought the wind and the heavy ocean currents all through the night, desperately trying to survive until he finally washed ashore near Marsh Harbor, completely exhausted, terrified, and broken by the loss of his wife. Wow. When you hear a story like that, your natural human instinct is to feel nothing but deep pity and sorrow for the man. You picture a husband fighting for his life, watching the love of his life vanish into the dark water and struggling against nature just to make it back to land alive. It sounded like a tragic case of the ocean being cruel, the kind of sudden disaster that can happen to any boating couple caught in bad weather. And initially, you can completely see why local law enforcement had no choice but to buy it. They didn't have a body, they didn't have a weapon, and they didn't have any immediate proof that he was spinning a massive web of lies. They held him for as long as the local island laws allowed, but without hard evidence, they legally had to open the door and let him fly back home to the States. But here is the thing about modern federal investigations. People can lie. They can practice their timelines, they can fake their tears, and they can look an experienced detective straight in the eye and play the part of a grieving victim. But GPS data does not have a conscience. It doesn't care about your alibi, it doesn't feel bad for you, and it never changes its story. While Brian was sticking to his narrative, giving media statements, and trying to blend back into his normal routine, federal investigators went straight for his digital footprint. They didn't just listen to his spoken words. They went looking for the cold, unyielding data. They seized his electronic devices, his cell phones, and the boat's internal navigation systems, and they extracted the digital forensics from the night Lynette disappeared. What they uncovered completely shattered his entire alibi into a million pieces. The GPS data did not show a small, helpless dinghy drifting around aimlessly with the wind and the ocean currents for 9 hours, while a terrified husband frantically tried to paddle to shore with his hands. It didn't show anything even close to that. Instead, the satellite tracking data revealed a completely different reality. It mapped out a distinct, highly deliberate route. The data proved that the vessel was actually moving under power and that it made a specific, previously undisclosed stop out on the open water before it ever returned to land. Think about how heavy that is. He didn't just get confused because he was panicking in the dark. If you are out on a boat in a crisis, you don't accidentally misremember being miles away from where you actually were. Third, the tracking data strongly suggests that he actively looked at the rescue and recovery teams and pointed them miles away from where they actually needed to look. He sent search boats, helicopters, and divers out to a completely wrong section of the ocean, forcing them to waste priceless hours looking in an empty area while the real location remained completely untouched. When the local police let him go, they were operating purely on his spoken word and the lack of immediate physical evidence on the island. But the federal agents who took over looked at the cellular pings from his phone, the precise satellite tracking records, and the boat's internal navigation apps. They mapped everything out, looked at the actual weather data and ocean currents from that exact night, and they realized that Brian Hooker's 9-hour survival paddle story was a total physical impossibility. It literally could not have happened the way he described it to the police. It was scientifically and mechanically impossible. Let's think about the sheer weight of what Lynette's family is processing right now. They spent weeks believing this was an accident, trying to cope with the tragic loss of a loved one to the sea. Then, suddenly, federal agents show up at their door and tell them that the data shows the husband was lying the entire time. Imagine the whiplash of grief turning into absolute horror. You realize that the person who was supposed to protect her might have been spinning a calculated tale from the very second he hit the shore. It makes you feel sick to your stomach just thinking about it. We see cases like this from time to time, but it never gets any less shocking when the mask completely slips off. So, if he wasn't drifting helplessly, what was he actually doing during those 9 hours? That is the dark question that federal investigators are trying to answer right now with those sonar teams and cadaver dogs out at Elbow Cay. The data put a spotlight on a hidden location, a specific spot where his boat stopped and stayed still for a chunk of time in the middle of the night. That is why the U.S. Coast Guard cutter is sitting out there right now in those 25-foot deep waters. They aren't guessing anymore. They are looking exactly where the satellite data says his boat actually was, not where Brian told them to look. I want us to really understand how calculating this looks. When you think about a husband arriving on shore claiming he's exhausted from a 9-hour physical battle against the ocean, you expect his story to match the environment. But when investigators ran the tracking, they saw a boat moving intentionally, stopping purposefully, and navigating a route that required a running engine. The whole idea that the keys were lost at the bottom of the ocean with Lynette immediately falls apart if the boat was moving under electronic power during those exact hours. It is an absolute bomb drop for the investigation. Now, federal agents are piecing together the timeline minute by minute. They are looking at every single ping from his phone, trying to see who he might have contacted or what he was doing while he was supposedly stranded. This isn't just about pointing out a lie anymore, it's about uncovering a timeline of a suspected murder. Brian Hooker is currently out there somewhere, free in the United States, completely aware that the federal government has completely taken over the hunt for his wife. But as the sonar sweeps the bottom of the Sea of Abaco and the cadaver dogs walk the shorelines near the Abaco Inn, the ground beneath his feet is getting smaller every single day. The feds are building an airtight circumstantial case, and they are doing it by letting the data speak for a woman who can no longer speak for herself. Once the U.S. investigators realized the digital timeline was a complete fabrication, the entire momentum of this case shifted. The physical stakes hit a massive turning point, and the federal agents stopped asking nicely. They stopped waiting for Brian to voluntarily answer their questions, and they started taking things by force. When you are dealing with a potential homicide on the high seas, you cannot afford to wait around for a suspect to cooperate. You have to move fast before the elements, the salt water, or a bottle of bleach can destroy the truth. In a massive escalation, the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service officially tracked down and seized the couple's 46-foot sailboat, which was ironically named the Soulmate. Think about that name for a second. It is just incredibly heartbreaking and twisted when you look at where this story has ended up. They didn't stop with the main sailboat either. They also took physical custody of the small 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy, the exact same little boat that Brian claimed Lynette randomly bounced out of in the middle of a rough night. The feds didn't leave these vessels sitting in a tropical marina where anyone could tamper with them. They loaded both of them up onto a heavy transport and hauled them straight back to a high-security federal forensics lab in Florida. Right now, as we sit here talking about this, those two boats are sitting under bright fluorescent lights in a sterile government warehouse. Federal investigators are literally taking them apart piece by piece. They aren't just doing a quick walkthrough with a flashlight. No, they are peeling back the layers of these boats like an orange. Forensics teams are using a chemical called luminol to hunt for hidden blood tracking that the human eye could never see. Now, you might think that since these boats have been sitting in the salty ocean air and splashing through waves for 2 months, any biological evidence would be completely gone, right? But science is incredibly stubborn. Even if someone meticulously scrubs a deck with bleach, or even if gallons of seawater wash over a surface, blood leaves behind microscopic traces of iron. When investigators spray luminol in a pitch-black room, that iron causes a chemical reaction that glows a bright, haunting neon blue. The forensics teams are pulling up the wooden floorboards in the cabin. They are checking the incredibly tight spaces behind the built-in furniture, sweeping out the bilge pumps where all the cabin water eventually drains, and analyzing every single fiber and stray hair they can find on that boat. I see how this kind of deep physical search completely changes the game because it takes the narrative out of Brian's hands and hands it over to the scientists. If you haven't subscribed to U.S. Crime Cases yet, make sure to do it right now so you never miss an update on this case. And you have to picture what this teardown actually feels like for Lynette's family. They are forced to sit by and watch the very boat where she spent her final days get dismantled by people in white forensic suits. It is a deeply agonizing process for them because every piece of wood or torn fabric the feds pull out of that cabin could be the thing that reveals her final moments. Brian's whole defense relies on the idea that there was absolutely no physical struggle. He wants everyone to believe this was just a freak, silent accident caused by a sudden rough wave out in the open ocean. But if things actually got violent before Lynette went into the water, the physical structure of that boat is going to tell the real story. A 46-foot sailboat might sound pretty large when you see it sailing out on the water, but once you step inside the living quarters below deck, it is a highly confined, cramped space. The hallways are narrow, the ceilings are low, and everything is made of hard wood and fiberglass. If a physical fight broke out inside that cabin, or even on the narrow deck outside, it would be almost impossible not to leave a physical mark. When people fight for their lives, they grab onto things, they knock into walls, and they leave behind what experts call cast-off blood splatters, DNA transfers, or torn materials. Wow. The forensics team is specifically looking for things like broken latches on the cabinet doors, dented bulkheads, torn clothing fibers caught in the metal hinges, or any biological evidence that completely contradicts the simple idea of a slip and fall. They are looking closely at the companionway steps, the steep stairs that lead from the top deck down into the main cabin. If someone was pushed down those stairs, or if someone was forcefully held down, the wood grain itself can trap the evidence. The feds are even looking for signs of an active cleanup. If they find a heavy concentration of cleaning chemicals in a specific corner of the boat where there shouldn't be any, it suggests that someone spent time trying to erase a crime scene instead of calling for help. Seizing those boats was the ultimate way for the trap to close around Brian Hooker. He probably thought that once he made it back to the United States and left the Bahamian waters behind, the ocean had successfully washed away all his secrets. He thought the mystery was buried out there in the deep blue water. But the Coast Guard essentially boxed up his entire physical environment, put it on a trailer, and brought it directly into a controlled laboratory where nature couldn't protect him anymore. The digital GPS data from the phones gave the investigators the map, but these physical boats are likely going to give them the actual weapon they need for a conviction. Right now, the data analysts are performing a highly technical process where they match the timeline from the GPS satellite data directly to the internal computer systems of the sailboat and the dinghy. See, modern marine engines have their own internal computer brains, often called engine control units. These little computers log every single detail of a voyage. They record exactly what time the engine turned on, how many revolutions per minute it was running at, how much fuel was being consumed, and the exact second the motor was turned off. If the boat's internal engine data shows that the motor was running perfectly fine, purring along smoothly during the exact hours Brian claimed he was stranded and paddling for his life in the dark, his entire defense completely falls apart. It proves he wasn't a helpless victim fighting the sea. It proves he was operating a fully functional vessel while his wife was missing. If the boat's internal navigation system logs a specific route that matches that secret, undisclosed stop found on his phone data, it proves an active, intentional cover-up. There is simply no innocent explanation for why a man would lie to the police about where his boat was stopped on the night his wife disappeared. You don't just forget a random stop in the ocean when your spouse has just fallen overboard. It makes you realize that the federal investigators aren't just guessing or speculating anymore. They are letting the machines and the physical evidence do the talking. They are quietly and methodically building an airtight, circumstantial case right beneath his feet, utilizing science to ensure that Lynette's voice isn't completely erased from the narrative. While the forensics teams are meticulously tearing apart that boat in Florida, the real boots-on-the-ground action has absolutely exploded back down in the Bahamas. I want you to think about how agonizing this specific moment is for Lynette's loved ones. They are sitting at home in the States, miles away from the ocean, watching the news and knowing that two separate, massive operations are happening at the exact same time to find out what happened to her. Waiting for a phone call like that is a type of psychological torture that nobody should ever have to go through. But there is a small sliver of hope in how aggressive this search has become. The Bahamian government actually did something pretty rare and significant here. They officially granted special permission for the United States Coast Guard to bring heavy federal assets straight into their territorial waters. This means the feds can now canvass completely new, previously unsearched areas around Hopetown and Elbow Cay. I see how massive of a shift this is because usually foreign countries are very protective of their local jurisdictions and want to handle things themselves. But here, the Bahamian authorities clearly looked at the GPS data, saw the obvious deception, and opened the doors for the US government. Right? It shows that everybody involved is now on the exact same page. This was not just a tragic accident, and they need heavy equipment to find the truth. Leading this massive charge back on the water is the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norvell. If you haven't seen one of these ships in person, you have to understand the scale of it. It is a massive 154-foot Sentinel-class vessel. It is heavily equipped, painted bright white with that iconic orange stripe, and it is currently anchored right off the coast of the islands. It completely dominates the skyline out there. From that ship, they have deployed specialized dive teams and fast, rigid-hull inflatable boats to scan the exact coordinates that federal agents pulled from Brian's hidden GPS data. We aren't talking about a blind search anymore. They aren't just driving around looking at the surface of the water, hoping to spot something. The divers are plunging into waters that are about 25 feet deep, looking in a highly specific targeted zone. Wow. 25 feet might not sound like the deepest trench in the ocean, but when you are down there looking for a single piece of evidence, it is a vast, dark, and incredibly difficult environment to work in. These divers are methodically scanning the sandy bottom, checking around the coral reefs, and looking over the deep drop-offs. They are swimming through heavy ocean currents, looking for the one physical clue that will lock this case down forever. They are doing the heavy, heartbreaking, dangerous work so Lynette's family doesn't have to live in the dark anymore. You have to respect the absolute dedication of those dive teams. And the maritime efforts out on the water are being heavily backed up by boots right on the land. A highly specialized K-9 team from Florida's Broward County Sheriff's Office just hit the island to help with the ground search. They brought in a highly trained cadaver dog named Maggie. I want to explain why this is so important. This isn't a typical search and rescue dog looking for someone who is just lost in the woods or wandering around. Cadaver dogs are incredibly specific. They are trained to detect the scent of human remains, even if those remains have been completely submerged in salt water, washed over by the tides, or buried deep in the wet sand. Investigators and this incredible dog have been actively combing the local beaches, walking the shallow shorelines where the water meets the sand, and meticulously sweeping the grassy grounds right near the Abaco Inn. This matters heavily, and it hits incredibly close to home for her family, because the Abaco Inn is the absolute last place anyone actually saw Lynette Hooker alive and happy. Imagine being a local worker or a tourist staying at that inn right now. You are watching federal agents and a working search dog walk the exact same paths where a husband and wife were supposed to be enjoying a relaxing vacation just a couple of months ago. It completely changes the atmosphere of the entire island. It brings the harsh, ugly reality of her disappearance right onto the front steps of where they last spent time together. Every time that dog pauses or sniffs a patch of sand, the handlers hold their breath. But while dive teams drop into the salty water and cadaver dogs sweep the breezy beaches, the public's attention has actively pivoted to one glaring, incredibly frustrating question. Where in the world is Brian Hooker? Think about this timeline. After he was initially arrested, questioned, and then released by the Bahamian authorities due to a lack of a body, he just got on a plane and flew right back to his normal life in the United States. He has totally denied any wrongdoing from the very beginning. He stood there and told the media that he never harmed Lynette, that he loved her deeply, and that he just wants to find her and bring her home. But as this investigation shifts hard into a federal homicide framework, as the feds physically seize his boats in Florida and the Coast Guard swarms the islands, Brian has seemingly vanished from the public eye. He isn't out there giving interviews to the local news anymore. He isn't organizing community search parties or raising money to find his wife. Internet sleuths, true crime communities, and even his own close acquaintances are fueling massive speculation that he has actively fled the country to avoid the feds. One source, who claims to be a close personal friend of Brian's, pointed out the obvious reality of the situation. Brian is not a guy who can just blend into a crowd at the local grocery store. He is a tall 6'4" man with a prominent Marine Corps tattoo, ultra white hair, and a very distinct, confident look about him. The friend stated something that really puts this whole disappearance into perspective. He said, "You're telling me, Brian, 6'4", Marine Corps tattoo, ultra white hair, smirk of the century, has not had one person at a Safeway, a QT, or a Buc-ee's or In-Out spot him, and right? That makes total logical sense. We live in an era where everyone has a camera in their pocket. It does not make any sense that a guy who looks exactly like that, a guy who stands out in almost any room he walks into, is just blending in somewhere in the States completely unnoticed for weeks on end. If he was just laying low at a cheap motel or staying out of sight at a family member's house, somebody getting gas, picking up coffee, or grabbing groceries would have definitely seen him and called it into the tip line by now. People are actively looking for his face. This glaring absence has led to the heavy theory that he crossed the California-Mexico border, either by land or by water, before the federal agents could officially lock him down. People are pointing out online that day trips across the San Diego border into Tijuana have historically required minimal identification checks. If you catch the border at the right time, making an undetected exit is totally plausible if he moved fast enough after he got back to the States. Plus, you really have to remember who we are dealing with here. Given his heavy maritime experience, his knowledge of navigation, and his obvious comfort level out on the ocean, escaping by water down the western coast into Mexico is a heavily debated theory right now. He knows boats inside and out. He knows how to read the weather, avoid the major shipping lanes, and navigate in the dark. If he wanted to slip away quietly without going through a standard border checkpoint, the ocean is the easiest place for an experienced sailor to do it without leaving a digital footprint. The contrast here is just massive, and it really gets under your skin the more you think about it. On one side of the coin, you have this highly visible, deeply methodical cross-border federal search for his wife. You have massive Coast Guard ships, dedicated dive teams, specially trained dogs, and an entirely shattered family pleading for answers every single day. On the other side, you have his sudden, quiet disappearance from the public eye, which just continues to drive the dark mystery surrounding this whole tragedy. It is really hard to look at that sharp contrast and not feel incredibly angry for Lynette and the people who truly love her. If he really is innocent, if he really wants to find his wife like he claimed, why wouldn't he be standing right there on the beach in the Bahamas, watching the boats, talking to the investigators, and demanding answers alongside her family? Instead, the silence from his end is deafening. As those dive teams hit the sandy bottom of the Sea of Abaco based on his own deleted coordinates, we are all just holding our breath, waiting to see exactly what they pull up to the surface. The feds are closing in, and they are using his own data to do it. But to understand why the investigators knew his 9-hour dinghy survival story was a total physical impossibility from day one, you have to look at the tides. Thank you so much for staying till the end. Please subscribe to U.S. Crime Cases right now for the next update on this tragic investigation.